And I actually have a title to my story, and the title of my story is called A Near Miss. And it was that darkest hour before dawn, and I was stepping into the plot, reaching and stretching for a bucket, when a great crash occurred overhead. An icy branch came hurtling down towards me. This story is about what happened next on that icy night a few winters ago, far up in the Hubbard Brook experimental forest, and what I learned about myself and what I'd like to share with all of you. I've never told this story to anyone before, and in fact, I'm a little ashamed by it. And there's only one person in the world who knows what happened that night, and that is the person it happened to. It's also a story about how I'm obsessed with ice storms. So let's step back just a little bit. I first got interested in ice storms back in 2009. I was returning from a conference in New York just as a large ice storm hit New England, and I had to drive through the teeth of it to get back to my office in Durham, New Hampshire. Cars were skidding off the roads in all directions. The highway was littered with tree limbs and downed electrical lines, and in some cases completely blocked by fallen trees. I arrived in Durham, shaken and trembling, and I stepped into my colleague, John Campbell's office, and I said, "What the heck was that?" Although I probably used more colorful language. He had been watching the devastation of the storm in Durham as well. As forest ecologists, we thought, if an ice storm could cause that much damage along highways and in towns, what could it do in a forest? And we both decided on the spot that we needed to know more. With a little reading, we soon learned that one, ice storms are already a big deal, and they regularly cause damage in northern forests worldwide. Two, climate scientists tell us that these winter storms might become more severe in a warming climate. And three, despite this, we really don't know much about them because they're super hard to study. They're unpredictable in time and space, and when a large ice storm does occur, even the most intrepid of researchers needs to be sheltering in place and not out taking measurements. But John and I were determined. We started by thinking we would be ice storm chasers, and we would have our to-go kits ready to study natural ice storms as they occurred across the Northeast. But we soon realized that ice storms are far too unpredictable for that to work. So instead, we had this crazy idea that perhaps we could make our own ice storms. It had never been done, but why not? To try this out, we turned to our very own outdoor laboratory, the Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. And with the help of our incredible staff, we soon learned that with firefighting pumps, hoses, and the right spray nozzles, we could coat trees with targeted amounts of ice under freezing conditions. That is, we could make ice storms. With this technique, we put together a team of some of the best forest ecologists in the world, and we wrote a successful proposal to the National Science Foundation. We think it might have been funded in part because the idea of making ice storms was so outlandish. In fact, one reviewer wrote, "If they pull this off, I want a front row seat at the show." And another reviewer wrote, "If they ever get a video, it will go viral." We did get a video, and it did go viral. We set up the experiment in the spring of 2015. We established 10 large plots about 3 miles up the gravel road from the Forest Service headquarters. Each plot was about the size of a basketball court. We assigned 5 treatments to 2 plots each. The treatments included no ice, which we call a reference, a mild, moderate, and extreme ice storm in 1 year, and a moderate ice storm in 2 consecutive years. We then spent the summer of 2015 measuring everything we could think of from the top of the forest canopy to the bottom of the rooting zone. We needed to understand the condition of the forest before the ice was applied so we could track the response of the forest to the treatments after the icing. And recalling my fear as I drove through that 2009 ice storm, I knew that safety was everything in this extreme experiment. and I was anointed the chief worrier. I made us practice the technique over and over under easy conditions in the summer and fall, so we would be flawless when the time arrived to ice for real in the cold and dark. I presided over endless safety meetings. I required everyone to wear radios to communicate with each other in the dark, everyone to have a buddy, and everyone to be dressed in protective rain gear and layers of warm clothes and helmets and face masks and goggles and even yellow reflective vests with our names on it so we could find each other and know who we were in the dark of the night. I made sure we had a warming tent and a medical transport snowmobile sled. I convinced the team that we needed not one, but two emergency medical technicians on site at all times during the icing. And we made meticulous plans for when and how to abort the experiment if something went awry. We were ready. It was the night of January 27th, 2016, and the temperatures were hovering around 20 degrees Fahrenheit, perfect for making ice. We had to ice at night when temperatures were coldest. We carefully laid out all the equipment in the afternoon, our pumps and hoses and generators and gas cans and lights, and we chopped a hole in the ice of the Hubbard Brook to access the water for our treatments. We had 30 volunteer scientists and technicians gathered from all over New England to pull this off. Recruiting was easy because everyone wanted to be a part of this crazy experiment. One team of 15 would be doing the hard work of icing the plots, and another team of 15 would be at headquarters waiting to relieve the first team for when they got too cold and tired. Each team consisted of 2 crews, with each crew assigned to an ATV equipped with a pump and a sprayer. The crews included drivers, sprayers, runners, hose tenders, mechanics, EMTs, and the crew leader. At 7:08 p.m., everyone was in place on plot 3, a moderate ice storm plot. The crew leader walked to the bank of the Hubbard Brook, and we all waited nervously in silence for the roar of the gasoline-powered pump as it turned on. It caught, it turned over, and it was followed by this great sucking noise as the pump began to slurp water from the brook and pushed it through the hoses to a second set of pumps on the backs of the ATVs. And from there, both crews started spraying water up and over the canopy so that it would come down as a fine mist, freezing on limbs and tree trunks on contact. Each crew covered half the plot, spraying water towards each other in great rotating arcs. The ATVs snaked their way back and forth along the sides of the plots, creating layer after thin layer of ice on the trees. At first, it felt like nothing was happening. Then a thin layer of ice accumulated on the branches. Then a thicker layer gleamed in the moonlight. It was strikingly beautiful, and we were all entranced and craned our necks upward to take in the view. The sound was incredible, like a million tiny wine glasses clinking gently together in the treetops. After about a quarter inch of ice, things started happening. Branches began to bend downward and sway a bit. Ice-coated twigs began to break and fall, littering the snowy ground with dark debris. We kept icing, branches kept bending, twigs kept falling. We got closer to half an inch of ice. Tree limbs started cracking under the weight of the frozen water, booming and crashing down with great thuds. We all cheered and clapped with the fall of each big branch. At 1:16 in the morning of January 28th, we had finished a creation of a moderate ice storm, and we stopped to take a break and change teams. Next up was plot 5, an extreme ice storm plot. We'd never added this much ice to a forest before, and we didn't know what to expect. It was 1:45 in the morning. The new team was in place. The streamside pump roared into action, and the 2 crews started their work of icing the forest. We went through the same phases as the first plot, but when we got to half an inch of ice, we kept on icing. Somewhere between half an inch and 3/4 of an inch of ice bigger branches started breaking, and finally tree trunks snapped and whole treetops crashed down, shredding and ripping the tree trunks as they fell. We were all safe on the outside of the plots, looking in. But the experience had gone from sublime to terrifying in the course of just a few hours. Altogether, we iced that single plot for almost 4 hours that night, finally stopping at 5:28 in the morning, having created an extreme ice storm. The plot looked like a bomb had exploded in it, and we were all encrusted in ice ourselves, and we were exhausted, and any exposed hairs, including our eyelashes, were glued together with ice, and we looked white and old and haggard. We turned off the pumps, we withdrew the hoses, and we sent most of the crew back to headquarters for a much-deserved breakfast of hot chocolate, chili, and cornbread. A few of us remained behind. We had to measure the ice on our specially designed ice collectors before it melted in the morning sun. John and I were the ringleaders of this small army. We'd been there from the start, and we were committed to stay to the bitter end. We helped with the ice measurements. We sent the ice measurers home. The last job was the buckets. We had placed bright orange 5-gallon buckets in the plots to catch the water as it came down through the canopy, so we could measure how much of the water stayed up in the treetops as ice and how much came down to the ground as water. Now we had to gather up the buckets. It was 6:45 in the morning. It was still dark. John and I, the last two standing, went into plot 3, the moderate ice storm plot, to collect the buckets, stepping over limbs like carcasses on the ground. Not a problem. Then it was time for plot 5, the extreme ice storm plot. We eyed it warily. I went in first, got a bucket, handed it to John. I went to the other side of the plot, got another bucket, handed it to John. It was time for the last bucket on a third side. I stepped into the plot. John was 2 feet behind me, just outside the plot, ready to retrieve the bucket when I handed it to him. I was reaching, stretching my hands for the bucket, and then it happened. A huge limb caught up in an ice gem at the top of the tree, let loose, and came careening down towards me with a thunderous clap. I turned feral, fueled by pure survival instincts. I catapulted myself out of the plot. A loud scream caught in my throat. But as I flew out, I, the queen of safety, somehow managed to grab onto John, and I pushed John into the plot, and as I used him to leverage my own way out. The limb crashed to the ground, not far from where I had been standing just a few seconds earlier. I turned in horror, desperately afraid of what had happened to John, expecting the worst. Thankfully, he was there, unhurt, intact, but he was wagging his finger at me, and through his mask and goggles, he was saying ruefully, "Really, Lindsey? You just pushed me into a plot under a falling branch to save yourself? Really?" It was a miss, a near miss, as we call it in the Forest Service. It could have been worse. I felt terrible and ashamed. I still do. At worst, John would never forgive me. At best, his view of me would be forever altered. But it gave me a renewed commitment to safety and an appreciation that no matter how carefully we plan, bad things can happen, and raw human emotions are as powerful and unpredictable as ice storms. When it comes to safety, we have to go even further than we can imagine and always expect the unexpected. After that episode, John and I reviewed every aspect of our safety protocol, and we made sure to collect the buckets from the plots in the daylight after looking up for hazard branches. And John, if he's out there, still works with me, and I think John is still my friend. Thank you.